Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest episode of Unearth Horticulture. Today the topic is plant vessels, and I will say this much. This topic combines my two favorite things, fashion and plants, because what would a plant collection be without the fun, quirky containers that you get to put all your plants in? Well, there is a stigma surrounding containers. A lot of people think that if your pot doesn't have a drainage hole, then you either don't know what you're doing or you're just bound to kill your plants. However, by the end of this episode, I hope that I have revolutionized the idea for you of what a plant vessel can look like, what it can be, and how you can keep your plants healthy by simply by selecting the right type of container. All right, so the first pot type, the first plant vessel type that we're going to talk about is the classic, the pot with drain hole. And let me just tell you the reason why drain holes are so important in container gardening. And that is because in nature, water can drain out of the root zone based on porosity, what type of soil you have, if it's clay, sand, loam, that kind of thing. You've heard maybe perhaps the term soil drainage and how that's important for different types of plants. Well, in container gardening, that water table, normally that outside in Kansas, maybe we have a lower water table. So that water table is where water naturally drains to based on the gravity. In containers, that water table is much shallower because it is the exact height of the pot. So it is very important to have drainage as a release for that water because roots do not like sitting in water. Although many of you have heard that it's a fun way, an easy way to propagate plants in a vase of water, and that's doable, those roots long-term aren't going to be happy and thriving in water, and eventually they will rot. So drainage holes are a way to prevent root rot from being as prevalent in your life. Now, I'm not saying that root rot won't happen if you have a drainage hole. It's just something that's gonna be a crutch for you, an escape. It won't be as likely if you have a pot with a drain hole. So drainage holes are great, especially for outdoor container gardening. However, there is one little problem, maybe big problem, with pots with drain holes when you bring plants inside, and that is the fact that they drain water all over your interior surfaces. So there are a couple of fixes to that. First, and one that I'm fond of, is you can actually get pots now that have silicone plugs in the bottom that makes it optional to plug that drain hole or to allow drainage to escape. And I like that because I can take the plug out to water the plants and pop it back in when I'm ready to put it back on the shelf. So that's a really fun way to do it. You can also, let me grab this really quick. Ooh, crispy. You can also use saucers. And I've been using vintage saucers that are without a cup because that's very sad, and I want to give those saucers new life again. So you can use old plates or a couple of saucers, or you can get plastic saucers at your garden center or store. But I have quite a few plants that are sitting on plates, and in the bus you can actually grab a few vintage saucers that I have gathered and acquired. They're really fun and really pretty underneath pottery, you know, joining that fashionability with your plant world. Saucers are a great way to do this. You can also create what's called a humidity tray with your saucers and put a layer of gravel or marbles in the saucer, fill that level with water, and then set the pot on top of that. So the pot's not actually sitting in the water, but that water is allowed to evaporate around the plant and creates a little microclimate, helping with humidity, especially during the winter. So saucers are very useful for multiple things. One thing I didn't mention is sometimes you can get pottery that has saucers that are attached to the bottom of the pot. These are actually quite popular, and so you still have a drain hole in the bottom. This is a McCoy. And you still have a drain hole in the bottom of the pot to allow that drainage, but then the water escapes into the saucer. Now, this isn't quite as good as just having a pot that has a drain into a saucer, that somewhere where the water can drain away from the root zone, because if the water sits in this saucer, it can still build back up and still cause moisture lower in the soil of the pot, the container. But one thing I will say is this kind of container, if there is water sitting in the saucer, at least you can tell if your plant is getting waterlogged. You'll be able to see the water sitting there and you'll know, I probably shouldn't be adding any more water to that situation right there. So that is one reason I do like this type of pot. So there is one type of pot that I actually don't have an example of, but I did not want to forget to mention it because they are also becoming very, very popular to use. And that is the self-watering pot. Now, I'm holding two African violets here because this plant family, the Gesneriads, Gesneriaceae, this type of plant family lends itself very well to self-watering pots. But there are not a lot of plants that I would suggest using self-watering pots for. So the way self-watering pots work, and I'm going to get a picture here to put on the screen to show you what they look like, is you can pour water. It depends on what brand you're using, but in really fancy interior design type pottery, you can pour the water in a tube in the side of the pot, and that water goes down into the bottom of the pot, and then there's like this reservoir that holds water and it sub-irrigates your plant. It means the water is drawn up into the soil. And that works for plants that like it pretty consistently moist. They don't like dry down cycles. And what I mean by dry down cycles is that they like their soil to dry out and then to get moist again, and then dry out and get moist again. Most plants like that healthy cycle because their roots like having that oxygen space around them. In their pores, in the pore space of the soil. If you have plants like African violets though, or Streptocarpella, plants like that are in this family, they really like consistent moisture. Ferns are another example of something that would probably do very well with self-watering pots. But just pro tip, if you are keeping succulents or any kind of arid plants like cacti or some foliage plants that need those dry down cycles, they're not going to do maybe quite as well on that consistent moisture that's offered by a self-watering pot. I should mention also that the reason self-watering pots are excellent for ferns and gesneriads or African violets is because those particular plants don't like leaf wetness, like at all. For ferns, it's because the wetness on their leaves actually causes the leaves to melt and kind of degrade. It gets slimy, it's kind of gross. And then with African violets, they don't actually like cold temperatures or temperature differences on their leaves. And sometimes, usually actually, the water we apply to our plants is cooler than the leaf temperature. So African violets don't like that. So the sub-irrigation that comes with self-watering pots works really well for those plants for that reason. So if you have a plant that has issues with leaf wetness and likes consistent moisture, self-watering pots are for you. Next on this vessel adventure is the cash pot. And this is actually an ironstone, what's called an ironstone pot, cash pot. And it was manufactured in England, and it's really quite the statement piece. And yes, this too is for sale on my website, and it's quite the looker. I think it might be my favorite collector's piece that I have right now for sale on my website. But the reason it's called a cash pot, you can see here, there's no drainage hole, and no, it's not sacrilege, it's not an issue, and let me tell you why. Cache is actually French, and it's a French word that means to stow away or to hide. And the way cache pots work is they're intended, you take your grower's pot, the plant that is planted in its ugly plastic pot that I grew it in the greenhouse, and you just drop it down into your cache pot. And then it's the system where you can actually lift it out of the cache pot to water it, and then you plop it back down in. And the cache pot hides the ugly grower's pot. So I really love the cache pot system because it's basically a saucer pot combination. And honestly, there's a reason we grow pots in the horticulture world grow plants in growers pots, those plastic pots with really good drainage. We grow them because they work and they're really healthy for container growing, healthy for your plants. And so cash pot system, it allows you, it hides the ugliness, but it allows you to grow in the best possible drainage situation. Now I have a few other examples here. Plants that this particularly works well for example, are orchids, especially Phalaenopsis orchids. And they're even sold this way in the grocery store, if you notice. So I have another pretty Roseville here, and this orchid is in a grower's pot, a clear pot, and it was just watered this morning actually. So this can be pulled out to water in the sink, and then when you're done, you let it drain out, and then you just plop it back in there. And there you go. Cash pot system working well. And I have another example. This is a staghorn fern, and I haven't mounted it yet because it's been doing so well in its container. But here it is in its pot. And then when I'm done watering it, letting it drain, I just plop it back into its cash pot. So that is a great way to use containers that don't have drainage holes. The next type of vessel I want to show you and talk about is the bowl or the pan. And these, as well as cash pots, they don't have drain holes, but they're very shallow, and you can see that. Now, sometimes planters are not always manufactured as planters. Like, I'm fairly positive this could have been manufactured as a planter, but it's a McCoy from mid-century, and it could have likely been used as a console bowl, something to display faux fruit in, you know. But honestly, this would work really well to plant a succulent garden in, or bulbs, for example. Those are really the two main types of plants that I would put in shallow containers like this that don't have drainage holes. Either succulents and cacti, like those arid plants that you would think of that have really shallow root systems that are fine, with fine root hairs, or bulbs that are gonna have most of their roots, it's gonna be like one season and they're done, and you're not gonna be keeping them in this container forever. So this is an example of a bulb pan or a succulent garden dish. Now I showed you this container at the beginning of the video, and this is my succulent garden right here. I have actually several because I like this style of planting. I have mixed in cacti and succulents. This is a crassula, an old man cactus, and kitten ears, tradescantia, some echeveria. These all work really well in a container together because they all have very fine root systems and they're very shallow. So they work well in this container together. And when I water this, and whenever you water a succulent garden, it's very important to do surface watering. You're not watering in the same way as you would a foliage plant that has a drain hole, where you want to see that water coming out of the drain hole, and you go through these full dry down cycles and then fully saturated soil, and then dry down and then saturate. This is more like, it's just like you're dieting your plants, you know, you're just giving them enough water to just get through, to chintz by, you know. That's the way you need to think of when you water plants that are in a bowl style planting with no drainage. Let's see here, I've got a few others. This is my Lifesaver plant. I just had to repot it because cats, let me tell you. Lifesaver plants are another one of those succulent style, pretty much any succulents, so succulent strings, Lifesaver plants, cacti, all of those plants that have really fine roots, they're gonna lend themselves well to this. Let me see, here's another one. Another way I like to use like window box style planters, this is another Roseville. Can you tell that we have a fondness for mid-century around this place? The way I like to use window planters sometimes is for propagation. Now, if you've ever propagated succulents, I'm gonna have to do a video on it. They like to form plant shoots and roots from their leaves when the leaves drop off. And so I like to have window planters where there's a lot of light so they can fit on a windowsill or a plant shelf. And then I just mist these gradually, and it helps them form roots and shoots, and they eventually root down into there. And shallow dishes that have lots of area on top are a great way to do this because I can just lay the succulent leaves on here. And that's a really fun way to propagate in these kind of dishes. One last thing I want to discuss with you, and this is very key, very important. It is a common myth that needs to be busted, and it has to do with drainage. Now, a lot of people think, and you can see I've got marbles in here, a lot of people think that using marbles or rocks or gravel in the bottom of a container before putting potting soil, layering in potting soil, and then planting your plant is a great way to add drainage in the bottom of the container, especially if there is no drain hole. This is actually a myth. It's not scientifically accurate. Instead, all you are doing is raising the water table in that soil, which means that you are making there's less room for roots to grow, and you're actually making a barrier. So the drainage is worse with gravel there. It has to do with how water physics works and pore space and adhesion. And I'm not going to bore you with all that. But the main thing is, if you put your gravel or marbles outside the container in a saucer, and then you put your plant on top of that and it's in a drainage hole container, in a container with drainage holes, then you are going to have extra room for drainage. That's a great way to improve drainage underneath your container, your vessel that already has a drain hole. But if you put the gravel inside the pot, then you're actually decreasing drainage. So that's a little pro tip for you today. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Unearth Horticulture. If you have any plant vessel questions, make sure you drop them in the comments below or reach out via direct message. And until next time, you've been watching Unearth Horticulture.